Our next speaker is Dr. Claire Hardy. So Dr. Claire Hardy is a senior lecturer in organizational health and well-being at Lancaster University's Center for Organizational Health and Well-being within the Faculty of Health and Medicine. So her research areas range from understanding and aiding employees who work internationally, employee stress and burnout, to productive health issues at work, and developing and evaluating workplace health interventions. So her talk today is about from financial to female employee reproductivity health, exploring applications of narrative processing across disciplines and topic areas. So Claire, ready when you are, and I'll give you space. I'll move
don't worry.
to the side. Cheers.
I hope you can see me and I hope you can hear me. Let me know. Cool. All right. Well, thank you. I think I follow on quite well from the last speaker, actually, because I'm kind of new to all of this. So by background, I'm actually a psychologist, specialising in workplaces and work psychology. And as Mo just said, I've got kind of like a range of different interests, really, from broadly employee health and well-being, things like stress, international assignments. But in particular, I'm interested in women's health and women's health in the context of work, more specifically reproductive health topics, which I'll go on to talk about in a little bit. And kind of, I felt a little bit out of my comfort zone when I was preparing for this session, actually, because I don't come from a computing background at all. I don't actually perform any narrative analysis or NLP, which in psychology means something completely different, talk about terminologies and things. So I don't think I was quite on the same page for a while more when we were talking to each other. And also, I don't specifically look in the finance sector either. I kind of look at all different sectors. But I was introduced to this particular approach by Mo, one of the organisers, who kind of explained to me what it was in very lay terms. Thank you. And it kind of, I guess it blew my mind as to what it could potentially do. And I could see so many useful crossovers between our fields and how applying this particular approach to my own topic of organisational health and well-being and reproductive health, I could just see so many advantages that are relevant to organisations that are in the finance sector, but to all different organisations and sectors, really, because I think most organisations actually employ female staff. So we're actually working on several kind of ideas and things at the moment. So I do feel like a little bit of an outsider, but what hopefully I'll share with you today is kind of just some of my thinking on the overlaps, and to share with you some of the ideas that I have for maybe working across disciplines. Okay, so in terms of just the outline of my talk today, so I thought I would just kind of give you a little bit more background in the kind of stuff that I do, and particularly the research methods and approaches and things that we use. Talk to you a little bit about kind of organisational health and wellbeing very broadly, in quite a generic way, to help you understand why I think this approach and this method has such potential. Then talk you through a little bit about kind of female reproductive health in general and why it's important to think about in workplaces and organisational health, wellbeing and their performance. And then start to talk to you about some of the areas that I think are particularly interesting, I think have potential, and that in particular comes from research and data that can be gathered from the internet, things like social media and things like websites with health information and their quality. And then finally just kind of wrap up and try and pull that all together with some of the ideas that I think are there. So we mentioned the low-hanging fruit by the last speaker. I definitely think they're there. I think there are so many that could possibly be done using NLP. But really it needs us to all work together, which hopefully we will be able to do. So in my field, kind of from a psychology background, a social science, I guess, we use a whole myriad of different methods, gathering qualitative data, we gather quantitative data, and we can gather it in kind of like what we call a primary way. So we actually go out, we might speak to people, we might do interviews, we might do surveys, focus groups, things like that. We might gather secondary data, which we tend to classify as kind of pre-existing data that's there. So a lot of the time in the work that I do, it might be organisational data, employee data records, policy documentations, things like that. You know, we can have very kind of hard objective data such as that, or the more subjective data, people's perceptions, feelings, interpretations, things like that, which can include personal stories and narratives. So we do a whole myriad of different ways to try and gather data from lots of different ways, and there are pros and cons to any approach and method that you choose. And of course, the analysis that you apply as well. There are lots of different ways to analyse the data. Again, pros and cons to each. But kind of what I want to draw on, and what I guess makes me very excited about the idea of working with computing and NLP is just that in my field, and what the last speaker touched on, it takes so much time to actually go about thinking about the idea, you know, applying for funding, getting the funding, but actually designing the ways in which you're going to get the data, actually recruiting people to be part of your data, and then actually going about analysing it as well. It's really not easy to get willing participants. But then if you do get the data, then you have to kind of analyse it. So it just takes such a long time. I mean, last speaker said years. I mean, that's absolutely true. It can take a long, long time to get this stuff out there, which of course by that time things have already progressed. So it really is quite intensive in terms of time and costs. And we're kind of, you know, we're all human, and we get tired, and no matter how much we love the subject matter that we're looking into, we can get bored sometimes, and you know, we're prone to error and we're prone to mistakes, you know, especially if we're tired and we're trying to do a lot of things ourselves by hand. We have human biases as well that we need to be very mindful of and careful when we're kind of designing how we're collecting the data and analysing the data, because we want to try and avoid or reduce the risk of distorting the data and our interpretations of it. But all of those things that we have to do and we have to factor into the research that we do, just overall are really costly in terms of time, the resources that they need, the finances that you need to put into to actually support that work to get it done. So, you know, we need to do a lot of the thinking even before we actually go about getting the data. So I hope I'm getting the picture across that it really can take a long time to do all this. Now, when I met about and heard about this NLP and narrative analysis and computer learning, to be honest, I couldn't believe what I was hearing, that actually computers could learn and understand and interpret kind of language and do it quite reliably as well, it seems. If I'm honest, I still can't really get my head around it, but I actually don't have to, because I've got colleagues who know about this and who know how to do it. So that's great, because I think one of the biggest advantages I can see in trying to work together and applying these approaches from computing to what I do is just the efficiency of it. You know, the ability to potentially repeat analyses over time periods, you know, without human beings actually needing to go out and gather the data and analyze it by hand every time. You know, in my field, that would take such a long time to do that kind of longitudinal research, very costly as well. But even just a single time point, a single snapshot a cross-sectional piece of research, you know, from my perspective, if you can use this computational approach, you could really cut down and make it a lot more efficient and be able to share those results a lot more timely, in a more timely fashion with organisations and the discipline. So, you know, when I was hearing all about this wonderful magic, what it seemed to me, I just thought, oh, brilliant, that's going to give me so much time, and I can just sit here. I can actually have more holidays because I can just have these computers run the data scraping, I think you call it, run the analyses largely without me, and it's so exciting to me to think that that might be possible. Now, I am joking a little bit. I know it just doesn't do it all, you know, without me. I know there's actually quite a lot of preparatory work and fine-tuning and things that go into it. But nevertheless, it still sounds pretty fantastic to me. So I'm currently working with colleagues at Lancaster in the computing department who are involved in this event, and some of the speakers as well actually today. And we're kind of looking at how we can bring together what I know about workplace health, well-being, and the topic of female reproductive health in the workplace. That topic in particular, which I'll come on to talk about, in the UK has been gaining a lot of momentum because there's quite a large push in the UK for equality, diversity, and inclusion. And actually, it's being pushed quite a lot in the finance sector as well, and financial organisations. So we're trying to think of how we can go about bringing our fields together to work on those areas. So just to kind of, I don't know why it's gone a bit funny, but to give you a little bit of background into my field, and forgive me if this is all, you all know this very, very well. I'm not sure who's on the call, but kind of within my field, which is occupational psychology, organisational psychology, it has a few different names. There has been an absolute wealth of interest and focus on employee well-being and organisational well-being and health. And we have a lot of very well-researched models, defined concepts, identification and understanding of different factors that can play a role in different outcomes of interest. Those can be things at a more kind of individual level. We can look at factors, things like personality of employees, their psychological resilience, stress. We've got kind of group level factors like teams. We do look at more organisational, contextual factors like workplace culture, but there's things like job-related factors, environmental working conditions, like physical aspects of work, but also the more kind of psychosocial aspects of work, you know, perceptions of someone's demands of the job, how much control they have, their level of autonomy. There's a lot of research out there, and there are different models to try and understand that and understand how these different factors may relate to one another and affect one another, and how that can have an impact on employees' well-being, their performance at work, you know, and ultimately the organisation's health and outputs. But we take into account non-work factors as well that can play a role on employees and workforces, you know, work-life balance, dependence, caring, things like that. And there are lots of models, there are lots of factors that try to understand and try to predict how they interrelate with one another. And so from that, we then try to develop interventions to try and target maybe these components, maybe address problems in those areas that might be negatively impacting upon workplaces. So in my field, there's been, you know, decades and decades of research on these different elements, and it's taken a lot of time. It's taken a lot of money to build up this empirical and theoretical understanding of the field. And there are different positions on these, how to define these outcomes and these concepts, and different models of these different factors and how they interrelate with one another. And I think what we're going through right now with COVID and trying to work through still these different circumstances we find ourselves in, I think it opens up all sorts of really interesting avenues to test these different positions and these different models in our kind of new ways of working that we have. So it's actually a really exciting time given the horrible situation that it is. But what's also interesting to me in particular is that there seems to be sex and gender differences in the degree of impact that COVID might be having on the working lives of male and female employees and other communities and other health groups. But much of the research, if you kind of look in the literature, they can often focus on particular outcomes of interest. And some of the common ones, which you probably already know, or maybe have worked in yourselves, are things like, trying to really understand workplace stress, things like burnout, mental health. And the area that I'm particularly interested in is reproductive health, female reproductive health. And just as a kind of aside, you might be interested to know about almost like a subgenre that seems to have come about in the last kind of 10 years or so. It's called people analytics. It's kind of come about in about the last decade or so, I would say. And it's essentially where organizations use these dashboards within organizations to capture all employee and organizational data that they can. And they essentially pose questions, hypotheses to this data. They use empirical knowledge, they use the models, and they essentially carry out the data analysis on this data that's being captured through these dashboards, just to try and understand maybe a particular problem and what they can do about it to try and overcome this problem and help their staff and support their staff more and facilitate better working and better health outcomes for the staff, but also the organisation overall. So there's lots of stuff going on in the field. So to tell you, moving on to kind of a little bit about reproductive health. So this is an area I'm particularly interested in, and mostly female reproductive health. And the World Health Organization generally defines reproductive health as this. So reproductive health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease, and it relates to all matters of the reproductive system and to its functions and processes, which can include people's sex lives, practicing safe sex, thinking about having children, and also the freedom to decide as well, and the choices behind that, and contraception use. So it's quite wide-ranging. It applies to males and females, applies to us all, but for women in particular, there are a lot of different elements to this kind of health, and some of them can have quite a significant impact on their quality of life and can affect their working lives too. So reproductive health for women, there's different things that can occur at different stages of their life, and it refers to various aspects of kind of sexual health, but also just general reproductive health as well. And most females will experience or go through one or several of these at some point. So things like menstruation, monthly menstruation, happens to almost every single female. We've got things like fertility issues, use of contraception, pregnancy is a common one that we talk about. But there are also several kind of quite chronic health problems as well, which not a lot of people know about. But they do exist for quite a large proportion of women, things like endometriosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome, things called like premenstrual syndrome you may have heard of, but a severe form of that called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, The menopause as well is something that will happen to most women. So there are lots of things that can be experienced, and for some it can be quite difficult. For example, the menopause in the UK is quite a hot topic right now, especially within the context of work. And we have, you know, I think all of us, whichever country you're coming from, we have an aging population, we have an aging workforce. And in the UK, there's been a lot of attention on trying to retain workers for as long as possible. Now, the menopause is essentially when a female moves from being able to have children to what's called reproductive stage, to moving into a stage where they can no longer have children. And it's naturally occurring for every single woman, and it happens just because of change in reproductive hormones in the body, and that results in the cessation of menstruation. So you stop having periods, and that is essentially the definition of a menopause. It's a female's last menstrual cycle, and it normally happens in kind of their early 50s. Now, for some women, it happens without any problem whatsoever, but for most women, it typically comes with some symptoms that they have to go through temporarily. Most women, it's something called hot flushes. Around 80% of women will experience hot flushes at some point during their transition through their menopause. They can last for a few years. They do pass eventually, but it can be quite difficult for women, particularly at work, because it's not really spoken about. Reproductive health in general is not something that we talk about in society, but especially not in the context of work. And I often think that menopause is a little bit like where the issue of mental health was about 10 years ago. So we generally didn't talk about mental health at all 10 years ago, but now we kind of recognise it and we do talk about it because we can see how important it is to factor in, and the impact it can have on people and the impact it can have on our workforce and on businesses. So if they kind of don't recognise it, if they don't address it, provide help and support to its staff, it can be a real problem. Now, women make up about half of the workforce, broadly speaking, and fortunately, in terms of these particular health areas, things are changing. Things are started to be spoken about more, and in general, I think the time has passed really where organisations kind of don't recognise the need to appreciate that we have, you know, quite a diverse workforce, and that it's quite important to recognise that, you know, if we want to retain its talent, then we need to really think about the health and well-being of staff in general, but just the importance that sometimes just temporary experiences or temporary difficulties that people can have, you just need to be flexible with it and work with staff to try and help them when they're going through these fluctuations. You know, we all have them at some point in our life, and so we just need to have a little bit of understanding. But for many staff, particularly females, with issues like this, they often have to go through it themselves. There's no help, there's no support at work to get anything, no information or any support at all. Pregnancy, maternity, often those things are spoken about, but everything else is still pretty much taboo. And from my experience doing research, it can even be hard to gain access sometimes into organisations, even to ask staff about their experiences and their views on this subject matter. So we've had to be quite creative with how we've done things in the past. Fortunately, things are changing a lot more now, but you know, it was quite difficult to make headway in this area. So what myself and others have been doing, kind of alongside other work that we've been doing, is trying to look at the more kind of anonymous or kind of, I guess, faceless forums and spaces like social media, because they can potentially offer a way for us to just try to understand these experiences and these perceptions in quite a naturalistic way, in quite a raw way when they're presented online. So there's actually a growing amount of research that's been conducted and published that explores the kind of the shared views and experiences on social media platforms, maybe things like Reddit, Twitter, Facebook. There are other online websites as well, on a variety of different female health topics. And actually there is research to suggest that many women and men as well, it seems that they often turn to the internet first for their health related information rather than going to speak to a physician or their medical practitioner first. And that was pre-COVID. I imagine with COVID now, those figures have gone up a lot more. So what it kind of, what makes me certainly think is, what are people, what are women actually being exposed to, what are employees actually being exposed to on the internet that may potentially influence, if they're thinking about their own health experiences and what they can and should do. And I may be the only one in this room who's done this, but typing something into Google, some sort of health topic or a symptom that I think I have, and just seeing what comes up. It's pretty scary what Google tells you you've got if you just type it in, but it's very common. People do this generally, and so myself and others have been trying to understand just what comes up on the web, what are websites actually saying, what information is contained on there, is it accurate, kind of where is it coming from, and alarmingly, actually the information is really quite poor. The information that's come through is not really up to date, it's not particularly accurate, heavily biased towards trying to sell something to people, sadly. But all of this research, if we kind of come back to NLP, all of this research has generally been done by hand. So we've had to go to these websites, we've had to go to these forums ourselves, try to extract the data and go through it by hand to try and compress all of this information to address our research questions and understand what's happening out there. And it takes an enormous amount of time to do that. But I can see solutions with the work and approaches that NLP and computing do, that I just think would be really fantastic to pull together, to join forces and try and do this in a much more efficient way. So what I've been doing with colleagues here, we've been discussing, planning, submitting proposals, just to try and look at these potential issues. So trying to look at how we can use NLP to provide a much more efficient way to maybe understand what's being discussed out there on, say, Twitter, for example. Looking at how maybe we could carry out these assessments of quality of websites of different female health topics. And whilst we've discovered that it's not very easy to try and do it, and it's certainly not quick in the setting up of it, I think there is a lot of potential and possibility for being able to apply this method. But also maybe just getting some new insights as well. If something is being performed by computers, perhaps computers have the ability to spot patterns or identify factors that maybe we miss as human beings, that maybe we're biased to in some way. And I was thinking about, this particular workshop and the financial sector and the financial reporting that some of the other speakers have been talking about. And, there's possibility that similar things could be done. So whilst looking at financial documents and reporting, there's the potential to do something very similar with other types of organisational reports and documentation. For example, in my area, EDI policy, so equality, diversity, inclusion policies, their performance reports on those topic areas, maybe seeing what the content is there and how that might relate to organisational performance as well. But then potentially internal communications as well, I thought would be something particularly interesting to do that might be able to do far more rapidly than if we were to do it by hand. And just to see, what, talk about sentiments, things like that, how might those potentially relate to workplace and employee outcomes as well. So I think those are just a handful of ideas. I think there are so many different avenues that applying NLP to organisational health and well-being, female reproductive health, could do together, which if it was down to me and my team, it would take such a long time to do. And with things moving so rapidly and so quickly, actually, we really do need to find some way to do it more quickly so that we can actually share those insights and share those findings a lot more quickly with organisations, governments and other key stakeholders so that they can actually go about making the necessary changes very quickly. So I'm just looking at the time. I think I'm kind of getting roughly now to my end of the presentation and my time slot. So I'll kind of just wrap it up, I think, now, and just, I guess I say thank you for the organisers for inviting me. I know I was an absolute wild card and not in this field or discipline at all, but I find it really interesting. I found it really interesting listening to the speakers, and I hope maybe in the future I will be able to eloquently use the terminologies that you guys use in NLP a lot more fluidly. But that hopefully gives you a little bit of insight into the work that we do, and maybe spark some interest for you and any colleagues perhaps, maybe some ideas of potentially how we might be able to bring our fields together and possibly tackle some of these problems that exist in workplaces, but these also are applicable to the financial sector as well, particularly female reproductive health issues, which are increasingly on the agenda of these organisations. As I say, I'm already working with some colleagues on some of these ideas, but I'm always interested to discuss these more or think about other avenues as well. So those are my contact details. Feel free to get in touch, and I will stop there. Do you want to?
Yeah. So, thanks a lot, Claire. This is really interesting, inspiring at the same time. So you touch on a lot of topics that most of us in like NLP and computing will overlook. When we analyze data, we never think about like the diversity, even in the data itself, topics related to mental health or any issues with employees. And we know that employees are at the backbone of any market, and it will in the end affect the finance. So just to reiterate that the work between us started with you looking into a previous study that Steve and Paul were involved in, where there's lack of reporting on employees' well-being, and that's where your work comes in. And also, so if I want to ask a question here, I would ask is, do you think more reporting in these financial annual reports should focus on aspects related to employees' well-being or maybe women at work?
Yeah, I don't know if you can see me on this.
Yeah,
is it? Can you? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I do. And you know what? I think even more so now I heard about when I listened to some of the other speakers that these financial reporting seem to happen almost separate from the organisations themselves. It's separate companies that are actually producing these reports. I mean, that's just crazy to me. That kind of potentially has no resemblance to actually what's going on the ground, and yeah, organisational outputs and performances do, they are influenced by the workforce. Of course they are. They're kind of like the fundamentals. So having happy, healthy staff, just, I mean, to me, it seems like such a basic thing for any organisation to ensure that they're adequately addressing, resourcing, things like that. So I think it would be really good if they included those kind of elements in there, because, you know, workforce, work outputs, they're so together, you know. But
I agree. I mean, yeah, I mean, totally agree with that, and totally think that more reporting should focus on aspects related to things that you said we don't usually speak about. So there's seen a question from Vasiliki. So she asks, how would you view the interaction between the mental health and reproductive health in the workplace? Are these two entirely overlapping? And if not, what can be done to learn additionally from the latter?
I think they are interlinked, massively interlinked. I think it's actually interesting, because I remember years ago when I first started moving into the kind of the reproductive health arena and approaching different organisations who were kind of interested in it. They didn't know really who to speak to. They didn't know if it sat within health and well-being. They didn't know if it sat within kind of, in the UK we call it occupational health, and there's human resources that we have in the UK as well, and no one seemed to know who was responsible for this health issue, even though it's a health issue. It's really interesting because it isn't so separate. So I guess you've got general health, you've got obviously the mental health, physical health, and I guess reproductive health fits into both of those elements. It can affect somebody psychologically, but there can be physical symptoms and difficulties as well, which of course interact with one another as well. So it's a good question. I think they do overlap. I think it's probably ideal if you can look at them and provide some support in some way for the different areas, wherever it might be. And in workplaces in particular, just trying to create cultures that feel like it's safe to talk about these things, and it's safe to approach your line manager or whomever, whichever team or department tackles this in the organisation. Do staff feel like they can actually broach these subjects if they are having any difficulties and just need a little bit of information is mostly all that people need. I've totally gone off a tangent there, but is that answered your question? Yeah, I could go on for hours, as you know.
It's Raymond who asked that, but he can tell us in the chat. Sorry, it was Vasiliki. So there was another question also from Raymond, and I think that is an interesting one. So he wants to know, based on experience of you working on interdisciplinary projects, so what is the key factors for success in interdisciplinary like research and collaboration? Are there any hurdles in the process? I think there are.
Oh yeah.
Good to hear.
Well, absolutely. Well, I mean, the last speaker, I think, hit the nail on the head with all of them. I mean, you couldn't see me, but I was kind of nodding away, going, those are all absolutely true. A really big one is, for me anyway, is the language, the technical language. I mean, for a while I thought NLP, because we call it neuro-linguistic programming, a little bit of pop psychology. I thought, how is a computer doing that? And then I went, oh, right, okay, that's not what it stands for. So like acronyms and things, and the statistical outputs. So we're talking about type 1, type 2 error, hypothesis testing. That's what we use as well, but you call them different things. But I wouldn't know that. It's almost as if we need a course on matching up all of the different terminologies. So yeah, I think the language is huge, and I don't want to just repeat what the last speaker said, because I think it's all true, like timelines and things and how you share your outputs. Sure. I think because when we've been talking about things and putting in proposals, we've had to almost make sure that we've got multiple outputs so that our various disciplines are getting the boxes ticked that they need to, because you need to tick those boxes in order to show the next funder you can do all the things that they would be expecting you to do. So it's challenging, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. I'm just trying to read the last question from Paul, and then we'll move to the next speakers. We got like 1 minute left for an answer. So Paul says one angle we looked at with Steve, the previous speaker, was change in financial reporting regulation requirements over time. For example, related to strategy reporting over the last 10, 15 years. So he's asking, has there been regulatory change over the time related to companies reporting these topics that you've mentioned? So this might give a chance, give you change points that you can investigate in the narratives.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, there have been various kind of legal changes, I guess. So in the UK, we've got the Equalities Act, which essentially identifies certain characteristics which we class as protected characteristics, things like age, sex, sexual orientation, things like that. And they do change over time, actually. They're adding to them all the time. And I think when those different time points come out, I think that would be important to see how that might affect things. And different sectors have different things as well. So in universities in the UK, we have something called Athena Swan. And you can have different standards and grades. You can be gold, silver, bronze. So there are those almost like badges of honour, I guess. There might be something similar in financial sector that could be interesting to explore as well, and just see how that might have had an impact on things too.
I just want to thank you again for your time and for the really interesting, inspiring talk, and a tiny applause from our audience. Thanks a lot, Claire.